Hey, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to visiting lecture today with Help University Malaysia. Welcome to the Honorable Miss Kathleen Nunis as a Head Department of Law. As for the topic today is human rights challenge in an evolving world. Yeah, and for today's session, it's being live streamed on the University STEKOM YouTube channel. I know I will read our agenda this afternoon. First, we will start class presentation by Miss Kathleen and continue with the Q&A session after our IT presentation. And in the next session, we have time for documentation. And the last session is a time for closing. Okay, let's begin. We will start class presentation delivered by Miss Kathleen. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and it's lovely to be here with everyone online, as well as those who will be seeing this. My name is Kathleen. I'm the Head of Department of Law from Help University, and I will be speaking to you today on human rights challenges in an evolving world. So during the presentation, I will turn off my camera so that the slides can be focused on, and then I will turn it back on after that. All right. Would it work for me to speak for the full 1.5 hours and then half an hour, or would you like me to give a break in between?
1 hour 30 minutes is okay, Miss.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So let me just start. I will stop my video and share my slides. Okay, so today I'm going to be speaking to you about human rights, challenges in an evolving world. Now, this is an area which I'm very interested in because when we think of human rights, it is something that all of us as human beings have, and we share the same rights by very reason of our humanity. So I am going to divide the talk into these sections. The first one is a consideration of what human rights are. Secondly, a brief history of human rights, because it is interesting to note how human rights developed in order to understand how they are evolving, which takes me to the next part, which is the evolving needs in human rights. And with any step of evolution or change in society, there would be challenges. Challenges that different countries, different areas, different peoples would have to address in their own different ways. So the first section is, what are human rights? Human rights would look at things that it's a phrase that we hear a lot about, particularly over the last 30 years or so. But what actually are human rights? Now, in my presentation today, I'll be looking at from sources from the UN in particular, as well as certain other human rights organizations. Yeah. So the first thing, with law, you always define. That is the starting point. Now, the United Nations has defined human rights as being rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. They go on to say that everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. The important word there is the word inherent. When we look at something that is being inherent, it is basically within us, it is born within us. In other words, these rights belong to human beings by very reason of their humanity. And the fact is that these rights are provided for, they are owned, they are entitled to, regardless of discrimination. Now, the UN definition gives you some of the possible basis of discrimination, being race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. But what this definition also makes clear is that everyone is entitled to it regardless of the differences that may arise as a result of these issues. Yeah? The OHCHR defines human rights as rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state. These universal rights are inherent to us all, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. They range from the most fundamental, which is the right to life, to those that make life worth living, such as the rights to food, education, work, health, and liberty. Now, when one looks at this, again, the word used is inherent. Inherent because we are born with these rights. As long as we are born human. That's it. Yeah? And no one can say that we do not have these rights. Now, one of the most important international treaties when it comes to human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948. In the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was provided, and I quote, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." So, in its very preamble, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared that the recognition of a person, of every person's inherent dignity and equality and their inalienable right, that is the foundation upon which freedom, justice, and peace in the world would be built upon. Now, I will be touching a bit more on this when we look at the history of human rights, because there was a reason why the UDHR came about. Now, Article 1 provides that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Important words there. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That covers both the earlier definitions, in that there is to be no discrimination. Article 2 goes on to say, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So basically, what all these definitions and the UDHR in itself makes very, very clear is that human rights are rights which are inherent to every human being. They are not rights which are given, they are rights which a human being is born with. And in the enjoyment of these rights, there can be no discrimination. Discrimination on any basis. And as you can see, the basis which is mentioned is very wide. Yeah, the basis which is mentioned is very, very wide because it covers the nationality, race, culture, religion, sex, or other color. Yeah, and it would also cover property, political or other opinion. So basically, the enjoyment of these rights is to be by everyone. Now, examples of these rights would be right to life and liberty, the right to live and be free, to be free from slavery, to be free from torture, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. But there are also social and economic rights. So the right to work, the right to an education, the right to form an association, the right to marry and form a family, the right to political opinion. All of these are rights which human beings both have inherently and which are necessary for them to live. Now, when you look at human rights in itself, when you look at human rights in itself, there are some characteristics which human rights have. There are some characteristics which human rights have. So, the word universal. Human rights are universal in that they are to be enjoyed by all human beings. They are to be enjoyed by all human beings regardless of their background. So this is linked to the fact that there is to be no discrimination insofar as the enjoyment of human rights is concerned. Insofar as the enjoyment of human rights is concerned. They are inalienable. Inalienable has got two aspects to it. Okay? One is that it cannot be transferred. It cannot be transferred between one human being to another human being. I generally teach criminal law, so I will tell my class that when it comes to human rights, I cannot say that I have a greater right to property than you. I want to give you my right to own property, or I want to give you my right to life for, say, 10 years of my life. That may exist in science fiction, but it does not exist where we deal with human rights. So it's non-transferable. But from the same concept of being non-transferable, it also means that human rights should not be taken away. Yeah, human rights, every single human being's rights should not be taken away unless the law requires it. And even if the law requires it, it should only be after due process. So, for example, freedom, the right to liberty. We all have the right to liberty. Yeah, we cannot take away a person's right to liberty, and yet we have the penalty of imprisonment. But imprisonment would only be sanctioned if the law provides for it. And if that penalty, and if that penalty was imposed after due process. Okay? Interdependent and indivisible. What that means is that with all the whole range of human rights, they are interdependent upon each other. Yeah, they're interdependent on each other. For example, the right to work is also dependent on the right to education, because an employer has the right to ensure that his employees are trained. But if an employee is not educated or trained in any form, then what ends up being is, how do I get employment? Yeah? The right to social security, the right of freedom of choice, that is dependent on the right to self-determination, the right to choose where I go, what I express, what I think, what I profess. And what this also means is that they are indivisible. The rights are indivisible in the sense that if I deny a person one right, that denial will affect another right. If I take away a person's right to a fair trial, that would necessarily affect their right to liberty. If I take away a person's right to be free from torture, that would have an effect on their right to security. So the rights, human rights, when we look at them, we cannot look at the human rights just in silo. We have to consider human rights together because they affect each other. They are also equal. Yeah, they are also equal in that no human right is greater than the other. Although I'm sure everyone would have their own opinions about which right is more important. They are also based on the concept of equality. As we saw earlier, everybody is entitled to enjoy human rights without any discrimination. And finally, human rights will necessarily entail rights and obligations on both the state or the country, as well as the citizen. Yeah, there is an interdependency there as well. Because on the part of the state, the concept is that the state would assume the obligation and the duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights for its citizens. Now, what that means is that, in general, the state should actually refrain from interfering with or curtailing their citizens' enjoyment of human rights. However, at the same time, the citizens in a country need to ensure that while they do have a right to enjoy human rights, they also need to respect the human rights of others and part of that would be to adhere to the laws of the state. So it's a symbiotic relationship that is to exist between the state and its citizens or visitors to that state. Are there any questions so far? No? Okay. So let's get back to this. Now, when it comes to how human rights evolved, human rights is the concept of human rights is a fairly modern concept. What I've done here in this next slide is to look at human rights development from ancient times to what it is now. And when we look at this development, what we'll see is that human rights as we know it today actually only started to exist after World War II. Excuse me. Yeah, actually started only to exist after World War II. In ancient times, when I use the words ancient times, I'm talking about Greco-Roman times. There was this concept of natural law of nature. And there was a lot of philosophy involved in this. Be that as it may, in most of the civilizations, the law was laid down by either the king or a senate or the ruling parties. There was a keen interest on philosophy, where one can look at things like the school of Stoicism. And Roman law, in particular, developed jurisprudence and what they called the law of nations, jus gentium, which recognized that there were universal rights that extended beyond the rights of citizenship. But none of this was actually codified, and none applied internationally. Then in the Middle Ages, so what we're looking at here is from the 1200s up to the 1600s. Yeah, what we're looking at here is this. At that point in time, in Europe in particular, there was a lot of war and a lot of fighting for rights. And one of the first documents that actually put into place the rights of a party, of a group of persons, was the Magna Carta in 1215, which is when the Earls and the Barons of England got King John to sign the Magna Carta, ensuring their rights. Now, there was then a lot of religious upheaval in England, and different countries were fighting for, well, apart from territories and so on, there was also a lot of religious upheaval. And this resulted in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. What that was looked at is you take that, the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights in 1628, and the English Bill of Rights in 1689. All of this, these documents, what they did was they reduced the divine right of kings to an extent. But they were an acknowledgement of a certain form of rights. In this case, first the earls and the barons, and then religious rights. The 1700s and the early 1800s was a time of revolution, a time when there was a more nationalistic sense of human rights in the West. There was the American Revolution in 1774, and then the French Revolution in 1789. Both of these resulted in declarations. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 for America, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789 in France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in France actually used these words: men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. So this looked, the time of revolution there, it looked at national freedom, the freedom of a country granted in Europe. In the 1800s, on the other hand, slavery still existed. And one of the rights that was being fought for in the 1800s was freedom against slavery, in particular, which was finally granted. Not just fought as a result of the American Civil War, but also in the UK under a different guise. Which takes us to World War II. Now, World War II, as we all know, was one of the greatest loss of life at the time. We also know that there was the Holocaust. There was huge atrocities across Europe and Asia, into Africa, across the world. And as a result, the United Nations was established under the UN Charter. One of the requirements of the United Nations was actually to draft and to come to an agreement on human rights at an international level, so that it was not limited to a city or to a group of people or to a particular issue, but it would be applicable internationally. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed on the 10th of December 1948, was a culmination of it. So these documents are the documents which are the core elements of an international bill of human rights. In other words, it is following World War II. Yeah, following World War II, where human rights were looked at in terms of an international arena. Now, the UDHR contains a list of rights. To add to this, in 1976, there was the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So the ICESCR and the ICCPR, the two international covenants, then together with the UDHR and the subsequent protocols, form that range of international documents on human rights. Now, that is not to say that there were no fights in between the 1800s and World War II. There were many fights. One of which is the fight for women's rights. Yeah, the fight for trade unionism, the right to join a trade union, the right to education. So you can see that as we evolved, as society evolved, there came a point where there were more and more different rights that were required. The rights that were required or needed, say, in the 1950s and 60s, are different from the rights today. And one of the greatest or the biggest pendorong, if you like, evolving needs, right? One of the greatest influences or needs is actually our technological age. So today, some of the rights that have evolved due to the times. Now, what you see on the screen is just excerpts of some of the rights that have arisen, or some of the concerns that have arisen as a result of the way society has changed, of the way technology has evolved, medicine, and so on. So take the first one, aging and the population. At one point in time, living to 40, 45 was considered old. People could be grandparents at that age. However, today we know that it's not the same. Yeah, that is not so. Our world population is aging in almost every single country in the world. The number of oldest people, meaning those who are aged 60 and above, has increased. And this will probably grow in coming decades. To add to that, in some areas of the world, birth rates have dropped. So what we're facing is an aging population, yes, but also one where certain parts of areas of the population, you don't have young people as many. Now this has got effects on things like the retirement age. In Malaysia at one point, the retirement age was 55. The accepted retirement age was 55. Today, the minimum retirement age is 60. But do we require those who have reached the age of 60? Do we require them to retire? 60-year-olds today can be healthy and vigorous and still have a lot to contribute to society. But the reality is, unless you have the jobs to offer, then if a 60-year-old remains in a position in employment, what about the young generation who is coming out to work? Will they be able to find a job? Unemployment rates are rising. So that is one. Human trafficking. Human trafficking is not a new issue. Yeah, it is not a new issue. There has been human trafficking throughout history. It is just that it was not necessarily called human trafficking. Yeah, it was not necessarily called human trafficking. According to the numbers of the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, there has been an increasing global trend in human trafficking since 2010. Human trafficking has been used to spread fear by different parties, and victims either end up in forced labor or in the sex trade. It is difficult to actually track victims of human trafficking. And because it crosses borders, international law becomes important now as well. Climate change and the environment. I will be touching on this a little later, but we have all seen and experienced the effect of climate change. I remember when I was a child, we were taught in school that the monsoon came in certain months. Which one would be the easterly monsoon, which one would be the westerly monsoon, and what were the months. The months have all changed. So how does one preserve the climate? Because one of the human rights is the right to a clean environment. Children's rights. Now, children's rights are very, very important rights because a lot of children's rights revolves around safety and preservation. Which then brings us to online data and internet rights and safety. Now, the internet has developed, and this was not a right in the past. Yeah, this is not a right in the past. However, if you were looking at, say, the 70s or the 80s. However, in the past, definitely the past 24 to 25 years, with the internet, technology has changed the way we live. Data, access to data is an important right. But is the internet safe? Gender equality and LGBTQ rights. Gender equality is more specific to women's rights. And as our societies have changed, as the world has changed, and there is recognition of LGBTQ rights, there are issues that arise when it comes to LGBTQ rights. Food rights, a very old right, but it is a very relevant right because this refers to, we've got a starving population in some countries. Yeah, wars and unrest affect food production, and just as importantly, it affects the logistics of food being transported. So there may be food, but can that food reach its consumers? Which in turn affects the price of food. demand and supply. Refugee rights. There are refugees from areas of who flee different areas for different reasons. You could have a political refugee. You could have a refugee who is fleeing unrest in their country. On the one hand, humanitarian aid is important. It's important for countries to open their doors to accept their fellow human beings from areas which may be war torn. But on the other hand, countries also need to bear in mind their own resources. Are they able to provide for their own citizens? While at the same time, you're asking me to bring in someone who is not my citizen. And yet humanity demands that. So these are some of the areas which, although apart from things like online data and internet rights, as well as gender equality, and to an extent climate change, these are not necessarily new, but they have evolved because the world has evolved. The demand on the planet in itself has evolved. Yeah. So what I've done is, as I can't touch on all of them, and this is not an exhaustive list, I have chosen a few. Now, the first one I've chosen is climate change. Yeah, when one looks at climate change and the environment, as I said earlier, obviously there has been changes in the environment. The weather is hotter. Yeah, the weather is hotter. We have experienced all sorts of natural disasters. And they may be natural disasters which are unusual. Now, it has been very, very clear that human activities are the main driver behind climate change. And I'm sure we're all used to these words: greenhouse gases, fossil fuels, and the fact that there is a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is also why these two agreements were signed: the Kyoto Protocol in 1995 and then the Paris Agreement in 2015. Now, both these agreements require a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, in the burning of fossil fuels. And when one looks at it, it makes sense. Yeah, it does make sense to reduce it. And there is a system of penalties, if you like, which can be imposed on countries. So all countries are supposed to actually reduce their carbon footprint. They are supposed to submit nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which are supposed to outline a country's emission reduction targets. Thing is this: industrialization contributes towards development. Developing countries, in particular, face a greater challenge in actually reducing this, because it becomes like a catch-22 situation. I want to be industrialized, I want to be developed, But in order to be a developed country, I need to take certain steps. Unfortunately, those certain steps would have an effect on the NDCs. Yeah. So one of the suggestions is for support to be given to developing countries to assist them in implementing their climate change plans. Now, on the face of it, this may seem or appear to be hopeful, and it is to an extent. But on the other hand, what would work in one country may not work in another country. The needs of one country would not be the same as the needs of another country. And so, the NDC amounts in itself is a manner in which there can arise disagreement, or at the very least, heated discussion. Online data and internet rights and safety. Now, this is an area which is very quickly developing, but are our laws developing as quickly as that? We've all lived through the pandemic where we've had to work from home, our children have had to study from home. And in so doing, we were very heavily reliant on the internet. So one of the things is this: should there be a human right to data, to the internet? Is this one of the new forms of human rights? And if so, that has effects on things like the provision of these rights and the cost of the provision of these rights. How does one work around what is essentially also a business? Can countries actually guarantee that each one of their citizens, so not a visitor, a citizen, would have access to the internet, which is stable and safe whenever that citizen required such access? Would that overly burden the country's resources? But to add to that as well, is the internet safe? And one could argue that just as with any sphere, it isn't. It has its advantages, certainly. It is a necessity, definitely, today. I would not be able to speak to you today if it were not for the internet. But at the same time, there are risks of scams, identity theft, copyright infringement, plagiarism, monies being lost, cyberbullying as social media increases and changes and evolves. There is the risk of what are our children learning on the internet. Now, one of the issues or one of the challenges that does arise due to this right that I would argue we should all have, is the fact that laws have not yet caught up or laws evolve a bit more slowly than the internet evolves. We are now looking at AI, artificial intelligence. But our laws don't track that yet, not necessarily. And even if they do they provide sufficient protection that would cater for the inevitable evolution of AI? Would there need to be more cross-jurisdictional laws? Yeah, would there need to be more cross-jurisdictional laws? How does one handle this? So, when it comes to the internet and the right to use the internet, the other thing that comes up is whether or not the internet should be censored. Should there be control over what is allowed in a particular country? Because that does have an effect on freedom of expression, freedom of access. Now, the fact that freedom of expression is a right that can be actually censored is not a new thing. Yeah, it's not a new thing. But should it be? And if it is, how should it be? I think one of the guiding things here is that freedom of expression and freedom of speech, while a human right, does not include the freedom to hurt, which is why there are laws on defamation, which is why there are laws on privacy. So there is a very delicate balance when it comes to censorship of any form. Children's rights. Children are amongst the most vulnerable in any society. Children and the very old. And when it comes to children's rights, these are some of the challenges. Now, every child is actually born with the same rights to health, to life, to education, to a safe and secure childhood. Opportunities may vary between children, opportunities for development, but that basic right to safety is universal, is inalienable. The Convention on the Rights of the Child defines a child as any person under the age of 18. So it views the age of majority as 18, unless there are other laws that change that. The intention behind that definition was to ensure that the convention protected as many as possible. Yeah. There is the State of the World's Children report published annually by the United Nations Children's Fund. And these are some of the issues affecting children today, challenges to a child having rights. Children who live in poverty many a time do not have access to food, education, clean water, medication. They also can be victims of abuse and exploitation. Not that this cannot happen to children who come from well-to-do or wealthy backgrounds. However, a child who is living in poverty is generally, there is a greater potential for them to be exposed to things like malnutrition, to disease. Children living in areas of conflict, where there is any form of conflict, a child would be exposed to violence, again, exploitation, abuse. There is also the likelihood or the potential of children who are actually forced to be soldiers. There are children who are maybe separated from their families, displaced. In 2022, 7,622 children had been found to have been recruited and used by parties involved in conflict. They can be used as spies, as cooks, in combat roles, as human shields. One of the ways in which this was combated was with the establishment of the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate, something like 28 years ago, which required the release of children from being used as soldiers in conflict. When it comes to education, sorry? Sorry, did someone say something? Okay. When it comes to education, I think we can all agree that one of the ways to better a person's life is through education. However, access to education may not be easy. There are places where there is no mandatory um, age for education. Children may be required to leave school to help the family earn a living because of poverty. Yeah, children may not be able to advance in studying because, again, of poverty. So you can see the link there. Finally, the issue of child marriages. Despite the fact that we live in the 21st century, child marriages is and remains an issue in that there are those who are either choose to or are forced to marry before they hit the age of majority. And this is a phenomenon that is actually worldwide. It does not happen in only one area of the world, but it happens across the world. The child marriage, if in particular, if the child who's entering into the marriage, if the child is the woman or the girl in this case, it has huge repercussions on the girl in that she is denied her education and her own physical health may be affected, particularly if she starts having children early. And that in itself has got effects on other aspects, for example, an abusive relationship. So that in itself would show the interdependence of human rights. Now, as we move on, gender equality and LGBTQ rights. Okay, this is, I've put them together, although they're actually separate. Gender equality tends to look at women's rights. Yeah, gender equality tends to look at women's rights. And while LGBTQ rights obviously refer to the LGBTQ um, persons. Now, women and girls represent about half of the world's population. And while there have been inroads in gender equality, there has also been some limitations. Because when we look at women's rights or gender equality rights, it is actually linked to so many other rights. Yeah, education, as I put, reproductive rights, economic opportunities are just some of the issues that affect women. Why education? Yeah, why education? Because in some parts of the world, if it's linked to poverty, for example, if the choice is between educating a son or educating a daughter, it would be to educate the son. Yeah? Or women may not, or girls, if they are married young, may not have a right to actually study if they marry young. Reproductive rights. This is a controversial issue because it is linked to, very recently, as we've seen in America, the debate on the right to an abortion. In the case of Roe against Wade, and then the more recent case, which looks at a woman's right to have autonomy over her own body and choices as to her health. Now, reproductive rights are controversial because they are very, very linked to culture, to religion, and it is a sensitive issue because you may have an individual woman who is completely right to say that as a human being she has autonomy over her own physicality and her own choices. But on the other hand, laws affect a society, and society is made up of individuals. Are these rights open to being abused or taken too lightly? Are there any stops in place that can actually guarantee that they will be fully put into place and used responsibly? So it is not an area which there will be an easy answer. And I don't think it is an area which can actually be settled as easily as some may say. Economic opportunities. Yeah, economic opportunities. Now, generally, women may not always have the same economic opportunities as men may have. They may have the right to work, but at the same time, it may not be as easy for women to stay in a particular job for as long. Yeah. Although it is essential for women to actually be able to achieve equal opportunities in not just access to employment, but the ability to climb the ladder. Yeah. So not just access to employment, but the ability to climb that ladder and to earn an equal pay as men earn. Yeah, to earn an equal pay as men earn. At this point in time, a study by Guterres, the projection is that by 2030, there may be an annual $360 billion gap in gender earnings. This is worldwide, obviously. Yeah. So why is there that gap? And how does one counter it? Gender recognition and opportunities are linked to sorry, the slide should say LGBTQ rights, not LBGT. So the reason I chose this is because of the recent controversies that arose at the Olympics, where there were issues on trans women in certain sports. Again, this too is a very sensitive issue. It is an issue which has to be dealt with care, because as again medical science improves, psychological sciences improve, and we have members of our community who do not identify as the biological sex in which they were born, and have had the opportunity to have reassignment surgeries. The question is, what rights do they have? Do we recognize them in the gender of their birth, the sex of their birth, or the gender to which they identify? Do we allow a teenager to have a gender reassignment operation? Or do we ignore this? Do we ignore their gender identification and require them to live their lives in their biological, in the gender in which they were born? Do we ask them to pretend if in fact this exists? And when it comes to sport, do we allow a transgendered woman to compete against biologically born women? And vice versa, a trans man to compete against biological men? How do we deal with these issues? Because these issues will start arising. And on the one hand, you want to uphold a human right to compete in a sport. But on the other hand, what about the human rights of those who are born biologically male or female? I don't know how we're going to deal with this, how the different countries will have to deal with it, but at some point in time, I do think that this will have to be addressed. And one of the things that I would argue is that the recognition of a person's right should not be at the detriment of the right of another. Okay, I've actually finished this slightly early, so about 15 minutes earlier, but I can actually answer questions. You have any? Let me just start my camera. Okay, hi, I'm back. Okay, I can see some of the questions here. In an increasingly globalized world. Okay, question from Keenan.
Yeah, yeah, you can continue, Miss.
Okay, no, I'm thinking of my answer. All right. Uh, I think that it's possible that human rights can be universal. It's a question of how the countries would apply it. Yeah. I mean, I don't have an example to put it in context, but there are human rights which are universal. And what you've raised here, thank you for the question. What you've raised here in terms of cultural differences is actually a very real consideration because for human rights to actually be universal, yeah, there also has to be universal respect. Mm, let me give you an example. And it may not, it's not a legal example. Okay, I'll just, I mean, I'm speaking to you like I speak to my own students. So, yeah. As you know, I'm Malaysian and we're multicultural, multi ethnic as well. If I invite someone for a dinner, the meat or the protein dish that I would serve would be chicken or fish. And I would always ensure that I have a vegetarian option. Maybe lamb as well for the protein. And I would do so because I recognize that I have friends who are of different faiths, different cultures. And so I choose the one which is not going to offend any of them. And so that we can all eat together in and share together. So I think in that sense, when it comes to culture, there has to be that respect as well. Okay, next question. With the rise of from Abdul, with the rise. Well, Abdul, if given a choice, I would just march in. But obviously, one can't do that. Now, for the international organizations and governments, um, this is linked very much to sovereignty, a country's sovereignty. And I think history has also shown us sufficient conflict whereby if another country were to just march in and either take over or impose what they think is right, it doesn't always bode well for the country which is affected. Aid is important, but to some extent non-interference. Aid meaning humanitarian aid. Yeah. Okay. I hope that has answered your question. As technology particularly. Okay, Paulina, your question. I think that we have a lot of challenges when it comes to technology and its evolution. I believe my colleague from the dean of our IT department spoke with you last week or something along those lines. Privacy, so there are two things here, yeah? There's privacy and there's freedom of expression. Now, the right to privacy is a very important human right because I don't think everything we do ought to be under surveillance. However, that has always been with the proviso that national security, public well-being is not affected. So, should there be CCTV cameras or drones or things like that? The answer is no. I think there needs to be a huge curtailment of that because you don't know whether the invasion of privacy is for good or bad reason. Yeah, I think in that sense, the general perception that a person's home, a person should only be put under surveillance if there is sufficient evidence to show that they might be committing a crime, I think that would still remain true. Yeah. Now, the second part of this is freedom of expression. A very basic human right, yeah, to be able to think what we want to think, to have that opinion and the freedom to express that opinion. Um, Again, the challenge would be right now, actually, I'm seeing it already, whether we know what we can say or what we can't say. Because most of us have social media accounts. Sometimes it may not be by our birth certificate name, it could be under a nickname and things like that. And we seem to interact online without the curtails with which we would interact if we're interacting face to face. We seem to be developing into this space where whatever I say, I can say what I want and how I want, regardless of how other people would feel. And then the argument in support of that would be I have a right to freely express myself. But it still goes back to you do not have the right to hurt others. Yeah, and hurting others may not just be your friend. Hurting others may be, I'm using the word or your because I feel like I'm speaking to a class here. It may not be your friend, it may be the place you work at, your school, your family, your country. So I think that um, there needs to be perhaps a re-education of society as a whole on what is freedom of expression and the fact that this is a human right that also comes with responsibilities. And sometimes, yeah, when we think of human rights, we sometimes forget that we are not looking just at something that we have that we can fully utilize. We are also looking at it from the concept of from the position that it has to be used responsibly. Otherwise, what's the point? You know? Yeah. So I hope I've answered your questions. Is there any other questions? I think the other aspect to that is this. I think we sometimes forget that while I have human rights, so do you. And my right does not outweigh your right. We have the same rights. It's there's no discrimination based on anything, age, background, and so on. We have the same rights. So I cannot say that my right outweighs yours, or vice versa. Particularly the right not to be hurt. Yeah. Now, what I've shared with you today, um, partly, like I said, you can get it from the UN websites and so on, but I've also shared my opinion, my thoughts on this. So I hope it has um, maybe got you thinking. I know I haven't given you any answers because I don't think there are answers to these questions. These are questions which each individual and each country will have to find for themselves what works the best for them in terms of especially laws in these areas and how best to provide for their societies. But I do think that these are interesting challenges that will be faced and which we are all also facing. Yeah? Any other questions or feedback? I'm open to feedback. Feedback is always good.
Okay, I guess no one else asking again, Miss. Yeah, thank you for answering. I think it's very clear answers from Professora. Yeah, before we close this event, for all participants, please open your camera. I will take a picture on the count of three. Okay, one, two, three. Okay, another one. One, two, three. Thank you for your cooperation. Finally, we come to the end of visiting lecture today. We would like to thank you for Miss Kathleen for the wonderful information and sharing your knowledge. We hope this information will be beneficial for all participants. At least we hope to have more collaboration in the future with Help University Malaysia. The visiting lecture for today and here. We hope to see you soon. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed it tremendously, and I do hope that it's been of help. I hope to see you all again, maybe visit Indonesia itself. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.